Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombie it makes are us. Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? What is up, everybody? Today we'll be exploring one of the most popular books against capitalism in the 21st century, Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. Firstly, thank you for clicking on the video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. I generally don't like to poke holes if I don't have a solution for the problem, or rather just a better alternative. But luckily, I didn't write the book, so no. But to be fair, Mark Fisher did have a follow-up to the book called Asset Communism, but sadly, he passed away before finishing it. The Left and Capitalism. The book begins with an incisive critique of the left's inability to provide a viable alternative to neoliberal capitalism. He sets the stage for the book's overarching argument that capitalism's ideological dominance has rendered it seemingly inescapable, shaping not only the economic system but rather the very way we perceive reality. At the core of Fisher's argument is the notion that capitalist realism has instilled a pervasive belief that capitalism is not only the dominant political and economic system, but the only one imaginable, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. He then uses the famous quote from Slavoj Žižek where he says, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." And on face value, it seems to be true because I can think of a million ways that the world can end tomorrow, but it does seem quite impossible to think of another economic system taking over capitalism. This belief, Fisher argues, has been deeply internalized not only by the right, but also by the left. The left, historically a bastion of alternative visions, has been co-opted or neutralized to the point of self-destruction. Rather than challenging capitalism, much of the left operates within its frameworks, focusing on reform rather than systematic transformation. Fisher critiques neoliberal capitalism's strategy of individualizing systematic issues such as poverty, mental health, and inequality. He frames these problems as personal failings, weakening collective solidarity and turning societal issues into individual struggles. For example, he uses the increasing presence of depression amongst our society. When someone gets depressed, society handles this as an individual problem. It's your problem and you have the responsibility to fix it. There is no help from society, and you can only find help, ironically, if you pay someone to listen to you, which in itself is quite paradoxical. He argues that we are merely treating the symptoms of mental illnesses and not addressing the root causes of these issues. The increasing rise of mental illnesses are because of the capitalist system, and that all of the issues like poverty, mental health, and inequality are societal issues caused by the system. On the note of poverty, I always joke and say that when you are poor and depressed, you obviously go and look at all of these grind and hustle videos and inspirational quotes where you just need to work harder and you already have so much to be grateful for. And then I always say that gratefulness is propaganda from big capitalism to help perpetuate itself into the future, which I think is quite funny. But if I believe this is another question. Fisher also argues that capitalism relies on ongoing crises, where instability is seen as needed for progress, and the left's failure to offer a real alternative just keeps things the same. And I can see why he says this, because there is two options. One is that there is an alternative to capitalism, but it's just really hard to implement or get working. Or it's, as Fisher claims, that the post-capitalist world is easy to construct. It's just that capitalism is an all-consuming entity that we are too caught up in and made blind by to see the solution. You can obviously choose which one you think it is. It comes down to that saying where you need to break a few eggs to make an omelette, but all I see are broken eggs and no omelette. That is why I think it is so difficult for us to imagine an alternative system, because we have this past that plagues the left. Neoliberal capitalism maintains its dominance by making itself seem inevitable. It privatizes the future, shifting focus from collective possibilities to individual profit. This shift discourages utopian thinking, making alternatives to capitalism appear impossible. Innovation. One thing capitalism has always had over communism is that its competition fuels innovation. But I don't know how credible this statement is anymore. When we talk about the 1960s or 1970s, you can see a distinct shift in the fashion and the culture. For example, you always recognize the hairstyles and the disco and the hippies and whatever. But the closer we move towards the 2000s, the sense of change and innovation starts to fade. The same focus that drives capitalism to innovate can also cause it to stagnate. We no longer sell what is best for the consumer, but rather what makes the most money. If an inferior product is more profitable, then the innovation in that field stops. Because why would anyone want to sell something that generates less profit? Let's take a modern example. When I was a child, I eagerly awaited the next big movie, like the original Shrek or Finding Nemo. These films were astounding. But it's been 20 years and we haven't really seen anything of that sort ever since. Instead, we've seen countless sequels, remakes, and live-action adaptations. Why? Because making something original is risky and could lose money, while sticking to a proven formula almost guarantees profit. The same applies to video games. I remember in the PlayStation 2 era, when every new game felt like something never seen before. But now businesses prioritize capital incentives first and customer satisfaction second, which naturally makes people skeptical. We see this especially in the healthcare industry. The pharmaceutical industry isn't a charity. You might think they keep your best interest in mind. Hospitals, drug companies, doctors, they all want the same car, the same mansion, the same holiday as everyone else. They receive commissions for the pills they prescribe and make more or less money depending on the brand they prescribe. So it's obvious why this system is flawed. It's not about the best medicine, but rather which drug has the highest capital incentive. There's this one meme that I always think encapsulates this system best. Fisher goes on to talk about the entrepreneurial self, which refers to the idea that individuals are encouraged to see themselves as mini businesses. In simple terms, people are pushed to constantly market themselves, manage their personal brand, and treat every aspect of their lives, like education, work, hobbies, as opportunities for economic gain and personal advancement. This mindset can lead to stress and isolation because people are always trying to measure up to the standards of success set by capitalism. People aren't really seen as people anymore. They are seen as assets, something to be bought and sold to companies. You can see this happening most prominently with men, where many work jobs not because they enjoy them or have a passion for them, but simply because those jobs bring in the most money. And the rise of women doing the same thing in the 21st century is even more pronounced. The option of being a homemaker has largely disappeared. As Fisher argues, the economy is in a constant state of crisis, and so both men and women are forced to participate in the workforce just to survive. Origins. Now, how did this, let's say, capitalism trap begin? He traces this shift to the 1970s, when economic crises led leaders like Thatcher and Reagan to push privatization, deregulation, and cuts to public services. Influenced by economists like Milton Friedman, they prompted the idea that the free market should control everything. Over time, public goods like healthcare and education were treated as products, making people see themselves more as consumers than members of a shared society. The culture has become stuck in nostalgia, recycling the past instead of imagining new futures. He connects this to the neoliberalism's grip on society, where real change feels impossible. Politically, he critiques Thatcher's "there is no alternative" slogan, which convinced people capitalism was the only option. Even during crises like financial crashes or climate change, the system remains unchanged, with reforms only serving to strengthen it. A key idea is that capitalism thrives on crises, using instability to justify more privatization. Fisher also critiques the left for failing to push real alternatives. In the end, he argues that neoliberalism's dominance isn't just economic, it shapes how we think, making it hard to imagine a different future. Avant-Garde. There were always countercultures that fought against the system, but where are they now in our modern day? He explains that the avant-garde, once a movement pushing boundaries and questioning authority, has been absorbed by capitalism. Instead of being a force for change, radical art is now sold as trendy, making rebellion just another marketing tool. Fisher argues that this is how capitalism survives, by taking anything that challenges it and turning it into something that it can profit from. A key idea is that modern culture mostly recycles old ideas instead of creating new ones. Fisher criticizes how postmodern art and media reuses styles without adding anything original, leading to cultural stagnation. Under capitalism, creativity is controlled by market forces, making it hard to imagine truly different futures. Subcultures like punk and hip-hop, which once resisted mainstream culture, have been commercialized. Their styles and symbols, once rebellious, are now sold as fashion statements. Technology, while making art more accessible, also reinforces capitalist control. Online platforms encourage popularity over originality, further limiting creativity. In the end, capitalism turns even resistance into something it can sell, keeping its control intact. Public relations. Public relations has taken over institutions, shaping how they function under neoliberal capitalism. He argues that modern society prioritizes image over real progress, with organizations and individuals focused on looking successful rather than making meaningful change. Fisher first highlights how institutions, whether in business or education or politics, spend more effort managing their reputations than solving actual problems. The rise of audit culture means that success is measured through statistics and performance indicators rather than real-world impact. For example, you can sit at work the whole day and play on your phone. You know what the boss wants. He wants these papers done in a certain manner. He wants your numbers to reflect certain statistics. But these systems are exploitable. So what do? You obviously exploit them. And on the surface, you look like the best worker in the world. While in actuality, you just sat there scrolling through Instagram. The same can be said about a country's GDP. The GDP can be rising, but that's not to say that the country is doing better. It doesn't mean people are happier or have a higher living standard. But on paper, the economy is growing. It's all about chasing the image of success rather than actually achieving meaningful improvements. Education is a major victim of PR culture. Schools and universities are now run like businesses, competing for students and funding based on rankings, branding, and a standardized test score. Instead of encouraging critical thinking, education focuses on training students to fit market needs. Whenever I had to do a book review, I just studied the questions beforehand and said what they wanted to hear, and thus I got good grades. But did I ever really read the book? No. Did I understand what the message was? Not necessarily, but if you repeated all the information like a parrot, you got the same marks as the student that put in all the effort. PR culture keeps capitalism in place by creating the illusion that everything is fine. Freedom. A quote from Slavoj Žižek. The illusion of freedom is the strongest tool of oppression. Capitalism gives us the illusion of freedom to keep us from realizing the true nature of things, especially in the areas like finance and government regulations. These systems are deliberately kept vague, so when things go wrong, no one can be held accountable. Instead, the burden is shifted to individual responsibility. Well, this may not seem like a major issue. The problem is that we view structural problems as individual failures, and thus we cannot work together to address systematic issues. Marxist Supernanny. Titled Marxist Supernanny, in Chapter 9, Fisher discusses his deep skepticism about the political effectiveness of traditional leftist models that mirror authoritarian and bureaucratic structures associated with Stalinism. Fisher contrasts these with the emancipatory potential of Marxist theory, which has been distorted and misrepresented over time, particularly in the light of the failures of the Soviet model. He argues that Stalinism's bureaucratic and top-down structures have been presented as synonymous with socialism, thus discrediting the very ideas of collective, transformative political movements. Fisher argues that post-Soviet leftist thought remains trapped by Stalinism's failure. Instead of rejecting its authoritarianism, many defend or apologize for it, reducing critiques of capitalism to Soviet shortcomings. This defensiveness weakens the left's ability to challenge neoliberalism, reinforcing the idea that alternatives to capitalism are doomed to fail. In contrast, Fisher calls for a reimagination of leftist politics that moves beyond the constraints of Stalinism and its legacy. He argues that the left must reclaim Marxism's original emancipatory potential, focused on collective agency, imagination, and the transformation of societal and economic systems, rather than continuing to engage with the Soviet-style authoritarianism that has discredited socialism in the eyes of many. So where do I stand on all this? Well, there are certainly some valid critiques that should be heard and addressed. I think the answers might become clearer if we distinguish between capitalism and human nature. Some issues are inherent to us as humans and the way we behave. Others might stem from capitalism or the way that economic systems are structured in general. However, it's a bit of a cop-out answer, I would say, that if someone doesn't see an issue, it's just capitalism blocking their view, or that if I make a mistake and don't want to take responsibility, it's capitalism turning collective issues into individual ones. Well, there is some truth to these ideas, like all economic and philosophical debates. The discussion can become highly philosophical, making the answers to our questions unclear. Now, that said, I don't like to criticize something if I don't have a solution to the problem at hand. But I'd like to make a video on acid communism and explore the solutions Mark Fisher had in store for us.